Hey everybody, and welcome to Build It with Tim. On this week's episode, we're talking about password protecting an edit form, specifically using validation rules to make sure that when you want to edit a particular field for a record, you can only do so if you enter the correct password. All right, when we're finished with this particular build, we're going to have a system in place where we can search for records where we need to know a value, and we're going to search for an exact match of that value. So we're only going to be able to see the records when we know that particular value and search by it. And then once we actually find the record, then we can edit that record. We'll have the ability to actually fill out some of the form fields, in this case, provider note. I can go ahead and save this. Um, but if I want to archive the record, then I'm going to need a password. And that password, in this case, we've set this up to validate against a record value of the original ID. So I need to enter that ID correctly in order to save this form with that particular field, the archive field, actually edited. So within Tadabase, there's lots of different ways that we can provide secured access to manage records within your application. And you can do so using things like logged in user roles and things like that, different page security options. But there's also some more kind of unique ways that we can do this. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a bunch of records that are going to have essentially two fields that we're going to compare. Field number one is going to be some sort of unique value, like a password, and then the second field is going to be a inputted value that needs to match that first field. So let's get started just by adding our data table. And for this, I'm just going to import some mock data. So I'm going to pull this in from a CSV, and we'll just call this mock records for now. Now, the actual records that I have here are kind of like simulated medical records, but you can do this with anything. So I'm just going to browse from my CSV and import this table. Okay, so I have this ID field and this password field, which I'm actually not going to include in this case. I'm going to add that manually. And then we have these kind of fake fields, right? Diagnosis code, procedure code, and diagnosis description. And those can all be text fields. That's totally fine. So we're going to import this, and we're going to bring in 1,000 records that we can then use inside of our application. Okay, so I'm going to add this password field now. Now, this is going to be field number 2. This is going to be the inputted field that we're actually going to, actually, let's call this like record unlock. And this is going to be blank for now. As there are, as records are edited, this field is going to contain a value because it needs to match, in this case, this ID field. But for now, it's blank. Let's add two more fields here. These are going to be the editable fields. So one is going to be editable by anybody, and then the other field is only going to be able to be edited when you actually know the password. So that's going to be the one that is, you need to enter the correct value using validation rules in order to actually make changes here. So we're going to add these two fields now, and the first one we'll just call it something like a provider note. So in this case, we're going to edit the record. We're going to be able to add a note. And then the other option here is if we want to, let's say, like archive the record. Archive record. If we want to do this, then we'll need to input this value and pass the validation rules. So these are going to be our last two fields that we need. And now we are good to start building out the actual page. So again, the whole point of this, and I don't know if I stated this clearly enough earlier, but the whole point of this right now is that I'm not going to be logged into this application. Now, you certainly, I would recommend it, that you actually have, logged in users, define user roles, things of that nature, but this is an extra layer of security. So somebody who is logged in, let's say in this medical records, fake medical records example, I'm a nurse practitioner or something. I'm not a doctor. I don't know. There's different levels within the medical field, and I am editing this record, but not at the topmost level. So in this particular page, we're going to call this, we'll just call this app data because, again, this is all kind of fake. And it's going to be a table component that displays all of our mock records from our data table. Now, the fields that I'm not going to include here are the ID. So this is kind of like our hidden field that is a unique value for the record itself. We are not going to include the record unlock field. The provider note we can include, and archive, I suppose we don't need either. Now, we're going to add a edit link in order to actually edit this record. And we'll make a couple changes here just to spruce this up a little bit. We're going to show this in a pop-up, and we're going to change this to a button. So here's what this looks like now. Again, I'm not logged in, and I can see all of the records, which we're going to change here in a moment. And when I click on the Edit Record button, we have this pop-up window that also shows us all of the record information. So we need to make a couple more changes here. Number one, we don't want to see all the records. We want to search for a record using this unique value that's hidden and only show the record when it matches that unique value. And then the edit form we need to change so that when we choose archive, we're required to enter in this password that has to match an existing field. So let's go make those two changes now. The first thing we're going to do is add a new row, and we're going to add a search component to that. And we're going to be able to search through the mock records table. Okay, so we're going to link it to that table, and then we're going to select only load the table upon search. Now, what are we going to search? We're going to search the ID, and we're going to make sure that we require it. And in this particular case, we don't want to include all of the operators. I'm going to leave it on enable all for now so I can show you the difference. And that difference is like this. So when we refresh this page, you're going to see that table component is now hidden. And if I try to search anything like is any, nothing appears. So if I choose something like contains and I just put in a single letter, it's going to give us a bunch of results because the ID contains the letter K. Now, in our case, what we want is. So we want it to be an exact match. We only want to find a record when it's an exact match to that ID. So if I put in the letter K only for this one, there's no exact match where the ID is only K, so we're not going to get any results. So we can modify the search component even further, specifically the ID field that we're searching, to predefine what operators are going to be available. In this case, we're going to choose is, and that's going to be the only one that is available. Okay, and now when we go back and refresh, you're going to see that this looks different, and all we have is a text input, and every time we actually search this, it's going to use the operator of is in order to do an exact match. All right, so now that gives us well, one more layer of security, right? Where the records aren't there until you actually search an exact match. And that ID field is also not even listed here. So it's under the assumption that you have this information in front of you and you're searching something or somebody gives you that information and you're looking up a record. So here we are, we have this, and now we need to make changes to the actual edit form. So we will select our edit form back in the page builder, and let's set up this form to be a little bit more user friendly. So we're going to be showing 5 fields that we're going to make changes to, one of which is going to be locked. So to do this, let's change around the structure of this form a little bit, where we kind of have a 2-column thing. On the left, we're going to have all of our diagnosis code, procedure code, and diagnosis description fields. These I'm going to set to read only so that I cannot make changes to these. And the field that I can make a change to as anybody is going to be the provider note. So that's going to be left as is. And then the field that I'm going to include on this form that requires a password is going to be the archive record. And I need to also include the record unlock field because this is going to be the field where somebody actually inputs the value that we're going to compare to an existing value. So a couple things we can do to clean this up a little bit more is use display rules to say if archive record is yes, so somebody intends to archive the record, then we're going to show that record unlock field, otherwise we're going to hide it. And we're also going to then require the record unlock field, otherwise we're not going to require it. Now for the validation rule part of it and how we're actually going to compare the inputted field to the existing field, we're simply just going to set up a validation rule to say record unlock ID is, oops, I'm sorry, I had that right the first time. Record unlock is a record value of ID. So quickly, let's just take a look at the options that were presented here, just so that we have an understanding of what we're working with inside of validation rules. So in this dropdown where we want to compare the inputted value of record unlock, and we want to make sure that it is, we can choose a custom value. So in this case, it would have to match 1, 2, 3, 4 in order to pass the validation rules. We can choose form field value, which is another field that's actually that exists on the form component itself, or we can choose a record value. In this case, the ID, because it's not on the form, but it is on the record, right? We're editing the record, so we're actually kind of peeking behind the form to this hidden record value and comparing it. So record unlock is the record value of ID. And I'm sorry, we want to change this to is not. So record unlock is not a record value of ID. Then we'll say incorrect admin password. Sure. Okay, so I think we're in a good place now where we can test this again. First, I have to search an exact match in order to actually find this record. The next thing I can do is I can actually input a provider note and save it. Whoops, I need to make one more change. Okay, so in order to get past that particular issue, we're going to add a condition here to say if archive record is yes. So only when archive record is yes, the record unlock is not the ID, then we throw that particular error. So we can refresh this again and test this one more time. So here I can actually save the provider note. But if I go back in here and I select yes, then first of all, our display rule is going to trigger and it's now going to show us this field and require it. And you can see if I put in a value that doesn't match the original ID, then it's not going to let us actually archive this record. But if I do put in the value that matches the record value of the ID, then it's going to actually let us save the form. So the last thing we're going to do is add an additional record rule here in order to set that record unlock field back to a blank value. So a use case for something like this would be, let's say rather than archive record, let's say this was actually called lock record. And I can change that here on the actual form. So let's say this was lock record rather than archive record. Okay, and that was your intention with this particular design is we want to let somebody lock the record with a unique value and have to compare it back to a record value. So in this case, it's going to be lock record. And we'll set up a record rule to say every time this form is updated, we're going to ignore any validation rule and we're going to set the record unlock back to, nope, I'm sorry, we're going to set yes, record unlock back to a blank value. All right, so it's a little simple addition here, but what it does is actually makes a big difference in what your intended use case is. So if, let's say, we're searching for this record, we're editing that record. Now, in this case, the record is locked, right? And in order to record unlock, we're going to have to put in that value, compare it to the ID field for this record, and it will let us save this particular form. Now, when we go to do it again, that record rule has reset it back to a blank value. So now everything is kind of started from scratch, where in order to unlock it, we need to then enter that value in again, and now we're good to go. All right, so that's it for this week's episode of Build It with Tim. I hope you learned some additional techniques for adding layers of security to your application when it comes to managing and viewing your data. All right, I'll see you next week, everybody. Thanks for watching.